The lawyer didn't flinch when he slid the envelope across the desk. That was the part that stayed with me. No preamble, no softening, just a plain white envelope with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. The same careful, deliberate letters he used to label every drawer in his workshop. He set it down, folded his hands on top of a thick folder beside it, and looked at me the way a man does when he already knows what the paper says and has been carrying that knowledge for longer than he should have had to. "Before you open that," he said quietly, "there are some things you need to understand." I was 63 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office in a town I hadn't visited in 11 years, and my hands were shaking the way they used to when I was 17 and got called to the principal's office for something I didn't do. Around us, the building was perfectly still. No phones ringing, no voices in the hallway, just the low hum of a ceiling fan and the faint smell of old paper and lemon polish that reminded me, without warning, of my father's kitchen. All of this because of a clock. But I need to go back to the beginning. My name is Raymond Marsh. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Duluth, Minnesota, and another 4 as a department chair before my knees decided they were done with long hallways, and my doctor agreed with them. I retired to a small house on the east side of town, close enough to the lake that I can hear it when the wind comes in off the water at night. I grow tomatoes in the summer. I read more than I probably should. My wife passed 8 years ago, and I have learned, slowly and not always gracefully, how to be a man who lives alone without confusing solitude for peace. My father, Gerald Marsh, was 79 when he died. He lived his whole life in Harwick, Ohio, a town of about 12,000 people built around a river and a paper mill that closed before I finished college. Dad had been a watchmaker, not in the romanticized sense people imagine when they hear that word. No velvet-lined cases or magnifying glasses perched on silk. He worked out of a narrow shop on Clement Street with a cracked front window he patched with clear tape every winter and replaced every spring. He fixed what other people gave up on: wrist watches, mantel clocks, grandfather clocks that hadn't run in decades. He had a gift for understanding mechanisms that refused to cooperate. He also had a saying: every time I left something unfinished, a half-read book, a conversation I walked away from, a problem I decided wasn't worth solving, he would look at me over the top of whatever he was working on and say, without raising his voice, "A stopped clock is still right twice a day, Raymond, but it's not telling you the time." I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was sitting in that lawyer's office holding an envelope I hadn't opened yet. My sister, Carolyn, handled most of the arrangements when Dad passed. She lived 40 minutes from Harwick and had been his primary caregiver for the last several years, ever since his eyesight started going and he could no longer drive himself to appointments. Carolyn is 6 years younger than me and has always been better at logistics. She knows how to make phone calls, fill out forms, manage things that I tend to let slide. When Dad's health declined, it made sense that she would step in. I was in Minnesota. She was close. I trusted her. I flew in for the funeral, stayed a week, and flew back. There was nothing unusual about that. Dad and I had talked every Sunday for 30 years, but I hadn't been to Harwick more than twice since my wife passed. Travel felt harder after that. Everything felt harder after that. The funeral was held on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of gray Ohio day that smells like wet leaves and approaching cold. Carolyn organized it efficiently, the way she organized everything. The right flowers, the right readings, the right number of sandwiches at the reception afterward. Her husband, a man named Glenn who sold commercial real estate and spoke mostly in declarative sentences. Stood beside her the whole time looking concerned in the practiced way of someone who has learned that looking concerned is what the situation requires. I stood at the graveside and thought about my father's hands, the way they moved when he was working. Patient and deliberate, never rushed. He used to say that a man who rushes a mechanism is a man who doesn't respect what's inside it. After the burial, we went back to Dad's house. Carolyn moved through it with quiet efficiency, already sorting, already planning. She mentioned an estate sale. She mentioned a property manager. She mentioned that the house would need to be listed before the winter market softened. Glenn nodded at each point like a man keeping score. I drifted to the workshop. Dad's workshop was in the back of the house, a converted sun porch with south-facing windows and built-in shelves that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. Every shelf was organized with the kind of meticulous care that takes decades to develop. Tiny labeled drawers for gears and springs and hands. Jars of cleaning solution lined up by age. Tools hanging on pegboards arranged by size and function. In the center of the room was his main workbench, worn smooth from years of use, lit by an articulated lamp he'd had since before I was born. On the bench sat a clock I didn't recognize. It was a mantel clock, old, maybe 100 years old, with a mahogany case gone dark with age. The face was ivory with Roman numerals and a small subsidiary dial below the main one that I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't running. The hands were stopped at 7 minutes past 3. There was a note taped to the base. My father's handwriting. Raymond, this one's for you. Don't let Carolyn handle it. Take it to Thomas Weller on Birch Road. He'll know what to do. I looked at the clock for a long time. Carolyn called from the kitchen that the caterers were ready to pack up. Did I want anything before they left? I folded the note and put it in my jacket pocket, and I carried the clock out to my rental car without mentioning it to anyone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my father's guest room, which smelled like cedar and the particular brand of hand soap he'd bought for 40 years, and I turned the note over in my head. Don't let Carolyn handle it. My father was not a man who spoke carelessly. He chose words the way he chose tools, the right one for the job, nothing extra. If he wrote those words, he wrote them because he meant them exactly as they read. I found Thomas Weller's address the next morning. He was 81, retired, and lived in a small ranch house on Birch Road with wind chimes on the porch and a vegetable garden going dormant for the winter. He'd been a watchmaker, too, decades ago. He and my father had been friends since their 30s. When I knocked, he answered quickly, as though he'd been expecting me. He looked at the clock under my arm, and something moved across his face. Not surprise, but recognition. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation to finally begin. "Come in," he said. "I'll make coffee." We sat at his kitchen table. He held the clock in both hands for a moment, turning it, examining the case. Then he set it down and looked at me. "Your father brought this to me 3 months ago," Thomas said. "He asked me to do something to it. I did. And then he asked me to wait." "Wait for what?" I asked. "For you to bring it back." He stood and carried the clock to the counter, where he set it under a bright utility light. He opened a small drawer below the kitchen counter and removed a thin tool I recognized from my father's workshop. He worked the back panel of the clock open carefully, tilting it toward the light. Inside the clock, behind the movement, fitted into a space that had been deliberately cleared, was a folded piece of paper sealed in a plastic sleeve. Thomas handed it to me without a word. Inside the sleeve was a key and a handwritten note. The note said, First National Savings, Harwick, Box 114. The account number is on the back. Do not tell Carolyn. I sat in Thomas Weller's kitchen for 20 minutes after reading that note. He poured more coffee. He didn't push me to talk. He just sat across from me with the patience of an 81-year-old man who has learned that some silences are necessary. Did he tell you what this was about? I asked eventually. Thomas set his mug down. He told me enough, he said. He told me he loved your sister, and he told me he was afraid of her. On the drive to the bank, my phone rang twice. The first call was Carolyn. She wanted to know if I was coming back to the house to help sort through Dad's books. I told her I had an errand to run. She asked what kind of errand. I said I was returning something I'd borrowed from an old neighbor of Dad's. A brief pause, the kind that lasts just long enough to let you know someone is thinking carefully before they respond. You didn't take anything from the workshop, did you? She asked. Her voice was light, casual, curious in the way that wasn't curious at all. Just some manuals, I said, old reference books, nothing worth anything. She said, okay. She said to come by when I was done. She said Glenn could help me with anything heavy if I needed to move things. The second call came 9 minutes later. It was Glenn. He said he was calling to check in, that he knew this was a hard week, that estate matters could get complicated fast, and he'd be happy to help coordinate. He mentioned that he had a contact at a property management firm who could start the listing process before the month was out. He mentioned that Dad's accounts would need to be consolidated and that he could help facilitate that too, if it would take some pressure off. I thanked him. I said I was fine. I hung up and gripped the steering wheel and watched the road. 2 calls, 11 minutes apart, both arriving within an hour of my visit to Thomas Weller, both steering me, gently, helpfully, with concern, away from doing anything independently. I kept driving. First National Savings was on the main street in Harwick, between a hardware store and a dry cleaner that had been there since I was in grade school. The building was brick, low, with a green awning and a parking lot that needed resurfacing. Inside, it was quiet and clean and smelled like institutional carpet. I brought the note, the key, my ID, and my father's death certificate. The teller at the counter, a young man with a careful part in his hair, looked at the account number, typed it in, and excused himself without a word. I waited. 4 minutes, then 7. I started to feel the specific loneliness of a man who has driven 2 hours on a feeling and might be about to discover the feeling was wrong. A woman came out from the back office. She was in her mid-50s, in a dark gray blazer, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the steady expression of someone who has learned not to let her face carry information prematurely. "Mr. Marsh?" she said. "Yes." "I'm Diane Holt. I manage the Harwick branch. Would you mind coming with me?" Her office was neat and small, with a window that looked onto the parking lot. She closed the door, sat down across from me, and placed a folder on the desk between us with the careful deliberateness of someone who has done this before and takes it seriously. "This account," she said, "has been flagged internally since 2018. I asked her what that meant. It means that when an access attempt was made that year, our verification system identified a problem with the authorization documents. The attempt was denied, but we kept a record. My mouth was dry. What kind of attempt? She opened the folder and turned it so I could read. There were scanned documents, a power of attorney filing dated 2018, signed with my father's name, and beside it, my father's actual signature from his account opening documents, pulled for comparison. The two signatures didn't match, not slightly, not in the way two signatures from the same person made years apart might drift. They were different in the way that reveals someone who studied the original carefully and then drew it from memory. Plausible at a distance, wrong up close. The account was locked after the failed attempt, Diane said. No one accessed it again. Who filed the power of attorney? I asked, though some part of me had already begun to understand. Diane met my eyes. Carolyn Marsh Fielding. The room didn't spin. I didn't feel shock, not exactly. I felt something more like recognition. The cold, quiet arrival of something I had been not quite thinking for years without letting myself complete the thought. The way Carolyn had steered my father's care. The way she answered questions on his behalf before he could answer them himself. The way she had gently suggested, more than once over the last several years, that Dad was getting confused, that he mixed things up, that I shouldn't worry too much about the details because she was handling it. Diane excused herself and made a phone call from outside the office. When she returned, there was someone with her. He was in his late 40s, in plain clothes with a notebook and the particular stillness of someone trained to observe. He introduced himself as Agent Paul Dreyer from the State Financial Crimes Unit. He sat down across from me with his notebook open and his pen resting on it, but not yet moving. "Your father's name came up in an existing review," he said. "When you walked in this morning with that key, it triggered a flag we've been watching for some time." He explained it the way investigators do, methodically, without editorializing. There had been a pattern of small withdrawals from another account my father held at a different institution. Amounts small enough not to trigger automatic review, consistent enough to suggest a system. The withdrawals corresponded to dates when Carolyn had been documented as present at that bank, handling matters on my father's behalf under a power of attorney that predated the forged one. A legitimate document, signed in 2015, that had been obtained when Dad's eyesight first began to fail. Legitimate authority, used in ways my father had not authorized. Then Agent Dreyer told me something that made me understand, for the first time, the full dimensions of what my father had built inside that clock. "There's a safe deposit box," he said. "Box 114. It's been registered to this account since 2017. Are you prepared to open it?" The box was long and flat, the kind you pull from the wall in a small private room with a single light above a narrow table. Diane placed it in front of me and stepped outside. I opened it. Inside were documents, dozens of them, organized with my father's characteristic care. Bank statements with specific transactions circled in red pen, each one dated and annotated in his handwriting. Photographs, printed from what must have been a phone he never told anyone he owned, of documents on a table, of a signature being compared to another, of a checkbook open to a page with amounts circled, a journal, 62 pages, handwritten, beginning in the fall of 2016, documenting every transaction he had questioned, every conversation where he had raised concerns and been dismissed, every time he had been told he was remembering wrong. The last entry was dated 4 months before he died. I'm not confused. I know the difference between what I signed and what I did not sign. I know the difference between what I said and what I am told I said. I have written all of it down so that there is a record that will outlive whatever story gets told about me after I am gone. Raymond will find this. He always finishes what he starts. I sat in that small room for a long time. The ceiling light hummed faintly. Outside, in the main hall of the bank, I could hear ordinary sounds: a phone, a printer, the low murmur of a transaction, the ordinary sounds of a day that had no idea what was sitting in this room. My father had been afraid to go to the police directly. Agent Dreyer had explained this, carefully, without judgment. By the time Dad had understood the full scope of what was happening, Carolyn had already established the narrative: that he was declining, that he got confused, that he sometimes misremembered. It's a story that, once started, is almost impossible to stop from the inside. The person telling it controls the information. The person it's being told about has already been labeled unreliable. So, my father did what he had always done when a mechanism refused to cooperate. He worked around it. He built a record no one could dismiss, stored it somewhere no one would think to look, hidden inside something old and stopped and unremarkable. And he trusted a stopped clock to tell the right time, eventually to the right person. Agent Dreyer asked me to do something I had not expected. He asked me to go home to Minnesota and act as though nothing had happened. Not forever, he said, just for now. The investigation was already underway. The documents in the box were significant. What they needed was time to trace the full scope before anyone with reason to destroy evidence knew they were being looked at. "You're asking me to have dinner with my sister this week and pretend I don't know," I said. "I'm asking you to protect the case your father spent 3 years building," he said. He was right, and I knew it, and it was still the hardest thing he could have asked. That evening, Carolyn made pot roast. She'd cooked it in my father's kitchen using my father's Dutch oven, and she served it on his dishes with the small blue border that I remembered from every family dinner of my childhood. Glenn ate with appetite and talked about property values in central Ohio. Carolyn refilled my glass twice and asked if I was doing all right, if the grief was hitting me in waves the way it sometimes does. I said yes. I said it was hitting in waves. I watched her hands as she cleared the table, steady and efficient, the hands of someone who believed the story she was living was still intact. I flew back to Duluth 2 days later. For the next 6 weeks, I did what Agent Dreyer had asked. I called Carolyn on Sundays, the way I had always called my father on Sundays, and I talked about nothing: the weather, a book I was reading, a former student who had sent me a note. I did not ask about finances. I did not mention Thomas Weller or Diane Holt or the man with the notebook who had sat across from me in a bank office in Harwick, Ohio, and told me my father had been right about everything. I started writing things down, not because I was instructed to, but because it was the only way I could hold what I knew without it pressing too hard against the ordinary shape of my days. I wrote in a notebook I kept in the drawer of my nightstand, and I wrote in my father's language: factual, precise, dated. Somewhere in the process of doing that, I began to understand what those journal entries in the safe deposit box had cost him. The discipline it takes to document instead of confront. The patience required to trust a system that has not yet proven itself trustworthy. 6 weeks after I left Harwick, Agent Dreyer called. "We're ready," he said. The warrants were executed on a Thursday morning. Simultaneous: Carolyn's house, Glenn's office, and a financial advisory firm that had been used to route a portion of the transfers through what appeared, on paper, to be legitimate estate management fees. I was in Duluth when it happened, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee I wasn't drinking, watching the clock on the wall above the stove. Agent Dreyer called at 9:14. "It went cleanly," he said. "Both are in custody. Glenn's firm cooperated immediately." I set the phone down on the table and sat very still for a moment. Outside, the lake was visible through the kitchen window, gray-green and cold under an overcast sky. A completely ordinary Thursday morning. The kind of morning my father would have spent at his bench, his lamp tilted toward whatever was currently refusing to run. Carolyn's attorney called that afternoon. His voice had the practiced warmth of someone who bills by the hour and knows that warmth is part of what he's selling. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said that family financial situations were always more complicated than they appeared from the outside. He said Carolyn deeply regretted any confusion and was prepared to discuss restoration of certain amounts as part of a good faith resolution. I asked him how much she was prepared to restore. He said a significant portion, subject to negotiation. I told him that my father had not been confused, and that what she had done had a name, and that name was not a misunderstanding. Then I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. The trial was 4 months later, in a federal courthouse in Columbus. I drove down alone. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I sat in the gallery and watched the prosecutor lay out 7 years of transactions, correspondence, and documents with the patient thoroughness of someone who respects the weight of what they're doing. The forensic accountant who testified was a woman who had clearly explained the same things to many juries. She described how small, consistent withdrawals remain below automatic review thresholds. She described how a power of attorney can be used legitimately and then used beyond its scope without the grantor's knowledge, particularly when the grantor has been characterized to others as declining. She described the shell of a financial arrangement that Glenn had constructed, modest enough to avoid obvious scrutiny, sustained over enough years to accumulate to something significant. When she finished, the courtroom was very quiet. Agent Dreyer testified after her. He described the safe deposit box and its contents with the same methodical calm. He read one sentence from my father's journal into the record. The final entry, the one I had read in the small room under the humming light. Carolyn sat at the defense table in a blue blazer I didn't recognize. She didn't look at me. Glenn sat separately, at a table to the left, with an attorney who had been arguing procedural points since the opening statements and losing every one of them. The sentences came down on a Friday. Carolyn received 5 years in federal prison with mandatory restitution. Glenn received 4, with the additional consequence that his real estate license was permanently revoked and the firm dissolved. I was sitting in my car in the courthouse parking lot when the sentences were announced. I had chosen not to be in the room when the gavel came down. I don't know exactly why. Perhaps because I had already arrived at the end of this story privately, in a bank office in Harwick 6 months earlier, and the courtroom was only the formal confirmation of something I had already finished grieving. I drove back to Duluth the same day, stopping once for gas and coffee. The drive took 7 hours. I listened to the radio for the first 2, and then turned it off and drove in silence, watching the landscape shift from Ohio farmland to Indiana highway to the long Minnesota straightaways I had learned to love in the years after my wife died. There is a particular quality to driving alone through a landscape, you know, the way it lets your mind settle without demanding anything of it. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Thomas Weller called to check on me. He asked how I was doing in the real sense, not the social sense. I told him I was doing something I hadn't expected. I was cleaning out my father's workshop. Carolyn's attorney had sent a letter early in the process establishing that the contents of the house were frozen pending legal proceedings. By the time the trial concluded, the property had been transferred to me as the sole living heir without encumbrance. I drove back to Harwick on a Saturday in March, when the last of the ice was coming off the river and the air smelled like mud and possibility. I spent 3 days in that workshop. I didn't rush it. I went through every drawer, every labeled jar, every tool on every pegboard. I found receipts going back decades. I found a customer log my father had kept by hand from 1974 forward. Hundreds of entries, each with the make, model, problem found, solution applied, and date returned. I found a photograph of my mother I hadn't seen before, young, laughing, standing in front of a car I didn't recognize, and on the second day, tucked inside a worn copy of a clockmaker's reference manual on the bottom shelf, I found a letter addressed to me, unsealed, as though he'd set it there in case I came looking and in case I didn't, both possibilities accounted for. Raymond, if you're reading this in the workshop, then you found the clock, and you did what needed to be done. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. By the time I understood what was happening, the ground had already shifted enough that I didn't know which conversations were private anymore. I wasn't losing my mind. I want you to know that with certainty, because I know how the story was being told. I'm leaving you what I saved because I want you to use it carefully. Not cautiously, carefully. There is a difference. Cautious men don't act. Careful men act well. You were always the one who finished things. Your sister was the one who managed them. I should have seen the difference sooner. I love you both. But I trusted you with this because you asked questions instead of making decisions for other people. A stopped clock is still right twice a day, Raymond, but only if someone is willing to look. Dad. I folded the letter and put it in my breast pocket, close to where a person keeps the things they want to carry with them. I didn't return to the house that night. I drove to the edge of town, parked on the old road above the river, and sat watching the water move in the dark for a long time. The money, once the legal proceedings resolved, was substantial. My father had saved through decades of quiet discipline, not extravagantly, but deliberately, in the way of a man who understands that mechanisms require maintenance, and that maintenance requires resources. What had been taken from him had been recovered through restitution. What remained was enough to change the shape of my life without changing the substance of it. I paid off the house in Duluth. I established a scholarship at the high school, where I taught for 31 years, awarded annually to a student who demonstrates what the application calls patient excellence, the ability to do hard things carefully over time without losing sight of why they matter, and I kept the clock. I brought it back to Duluth, had it properly cleaned and serviced by a horologist in the city, a young woman who talked about mechanisms the way my father used to, with respect and precision. She got it running. The movement was in remarkable condition, she said. Whoever had maintained it had done so with exceptional care over many decades. I set it on the mantel in my living room where I can hear it from the kitchen. The tick of it is steady, unhurried, the kind of sound that doesn't call attention to itself but becomes, over time, the baseline against which everything else is measured. Carolyn writes occasionally. Short letters, different in tone from what I expected, not accusatory, not explanatory, just factual. She is doing a program. She is reading more than she used to. She does not ask me to respond, and I haven't. Some conversations require both people to have arrived at a certain kind of honesty before they can be useful, and I'm not sure we are there yet. Perhaps we will be. I am in no rush. Glenn's name comes up occasionally in Harwick, I'm told. Not often. His absence from the business community left a gap that other people have filled without much ceremony, the way water fills any space that opens. Thomas Weller and I talk on the phone most Sundays now, the slot I used to reserve for my father. He tells me about his garden and his grandchildren and the particular clocks he's been asked to look at by people who find him through word of mouth. He tells me about my father, stories I hadn't heard, details from a friendship that spanned 50 years. I find I'm grateful for them in a way I couldn't have predicted. You spend your whole life with a parent and still discover, after they're gone, that there were rooms you never entered. There is a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in the way that a mechanism winds down, gradually in smaller and smaller increments, until one day the hands are still and you realize you've been watching the wrong thing. You should have been watching the movement. I am 63 years old. I grow tomatoes in the summer. I read more than I probably should. I have learned in the last year that the difference between a stopped clock and a broken one is the question of who has been caring for the movement. My father was not broken. He was stopped by people who should have kept faith with him in a house where he should have been safe. But the movement was intact, and when the right person came along to wind it, it ran. He always believed it would. He measured twice, and he waited. And he was right. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, if you have watched someone you love be told they are confused, be told their concerns are nothing, be told that the people managing things have only good intentions, then hear this part clearly. Write it down. Ask the questions that make people uncomfortable. Do not mistake a smooth answer for an honest one. Trust what you know. The truth doesn't disappear because it becomes inconvenient. It waits, patient as a mechanism that no one has bothered to wind in years, for the moment when someone finally stops long enough to listen for the tick. Thank you for sitting with me through this. I know it was not a simple story. The ones that matter rarely are. If it moves something in you, I would be grateful to hear it. Tell me what stayed with you, or tell me where you're listening from tonight. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about people who were not believed until they were, and about the ones who finally did the believing. If you'd like to be here for those, please consider subscribing. We'll keep going, carefully and together.